Awesome. Just a reminder to fill out that form, which we'll be dropping in the chat throughout the event to get your raffle entry and to sign in for attendance. But with that, I'm excited to introduce Geoffrey Zatkin here to share some of his insight from the gaming industry with us. So I will pass it off to you.
Oh, thanks for the intro. My name is Geoffrey Zatkin, and I will hopefully not be boring you for the rest of this hour and giving you a little bit of information. And let's see, let's get a slide advanced. And before I do a talk, I always like to kind of hold on, let's see. Oh, gotcha. We're going to do that to make the slideshow stuff work. I like to introduce who I am so that people kind of know the context I've been talking. So I've been in the video game industry for a while. I was a video game designer for about a decade, starting in 1997, member 6 or 7 or so of the original EverQuest team. And I've worked on a lot of MMOs, or massively multiplayer games. And before that, I was an indie developer, a MUD programmer, and a modder. And about '06, after a decade of designing games, I moved from game development to game research, founding EDAR, which became the biggest video game specific market research firm actually in the world. And we advised a large number of publishers and developers and exited via an acquisition to NPD Group in 2016. Exited means we sold our company. A little bit before selling in 2015, I founded the game development studio Experiment 7 to focus on making VR games. And we released 3 games, the last of which was Catan VR, which was the #1 seller on the Oculus Rift, Samsung Gear, Oculus Go, and Steam HTC. And in 2018, I joined the YouTube channel Extra Credits as senior management, and a year later became the channel's studio director. And we're a production house that distributes on YouTube. We create 2 to 3 short animated videos every week on history, mythology, and game design and game culture. We have 2.5 million subscribers and have launched more than 200 videos with 1 million views apiece. And I've spent a lot of time over the past 2 decades thinking about this topic of making really good video games and really good technology around them. And to me, a lot of making better games, in addition to the craft of game making, is the decisions that you make around making the game. And this is a talk about those decisions. And the question is, even from the beginning, why should you even care about some of these things? And the answer to that is that I've seen a lot of games fail. They get canceled, they don't sell anything, they cost more to make than they bring in, and then the company goes out of business. And failure can be a really wonderful teacher, and learning from other people failing is even better because that means you don't have to make those mistakes yourself. So I'm going to start out by saying something that often a lot of young designers and young people in tech don't like. But before I do that, I'm going to establish a little bit of gamer cred so you'll know where I'm coming from. So please indulge me for 90 seconds or so. And I'm 47, and I love video games. I've been playing D&D since I was 7. I own the basic D&D set, and I've played every edition. And I've been buying RPGs to read the rules since before I was 10. I used to go to conventions and play Car Wars and Battletech and Cyberpunk and Shadowruns and Champions and Paranoia. And I'm now friends actually with the guys who wrote Cyberpunk, the role-playing game, and Champions and Paranoia. And I've hired 2 of them, and one of them is an advisor to my dev studio, E7. I've been playing video games since Pong. I used to play competitive Street Fighter and Magic the Gathering. Played Warhammer 40K and was in the top 10 in the nation in their first Ardboys tournament, and put together an army comp that nobody had actually ever seen before, and which became an international trend. My most expensive item I've ever won at a charity auction is a 2-scale Warhammer 40K chainsword that's almost as big as I am. I played BBS games in high school, programmed and played MUDs in college, and used my Marathon mod. Marathon was the game Bungie made before Halo. Used mods of that in my MUD code to get my first gig as a game designer. I've played League of Legends for over 5 years, and top 20% of the players in the US went to the Staples Center in season 3 to see their finals. Knew Mike and Jerry from before the first PAX. Coined the terms DOT, CC, and AoE when I designed the EverQuest spell system. Drank a stormtrooper under the table once. Keynoted this talk at PAX Dev a few years ago. I've founded 3 different game studios, give conference talks to analyzing D&D and design choices, and run a YouTube channel that talks about games. Oh, and I also have 20 years of development in the video game industry. And I could do this for a while, but this is basically to tell you I love games. I love everything around games. I love making games. So kind of coming back to the thing that most people as they're starting out don't like, that there's a quote which I'm going to paraphrase, which I believe is attributed to one of the quintessential American artists, Norman Rockwell. And he said that artists make art, but the businesses and companies make product. And Norman Rockwell was an amazingly successful commercial artist. He made a living, and a very good living, selling art. So if you're making video games as a hobby and you don't care about selling them, then that's awesome. And you should absolutely do that and you should enjoy everything around it. But if this is your career, if you're making video games or other technology around this to get paid and maybe get a royalty, then you're actually in a business. And being in a business, part of your job is to sell something that people want to buy. And this doesn't mean that games and tech aren't cool, but it does mean that there's certain economic realities to it. So for the past few years, we've actually been in the middle of a renaissance of game creation. And while the barriers to having a AAA or S tier game have arguably never been higher, the barriers for small teams to create games that are really good quality have perhaps never been lower. And a lot of this is due to the amount of game engines like Unity and Unreal and the tool sets around them. But just for reference, last year, there were more than 5,000 commercially released games on consoles, handheld, and PC just in the United States. That's not counting iOS and Android, which had over 100,000 games released last year in North America alone. And this makes games basically a very competitive market. And if you're thinking to make games in this industry, you need every edge you can get. And even if you're not thinking on games, but you're thinking about tech, this also very much applies to you, because just making something good isn't enough to actually make it successful. And so what I put together is a list of kind of 10 things that if you can figure these out before you make a game or a tech project, it increases your likelihood of success and increases your likelihood of basically making more money, which means that you have enough money to go do other things in the future. And so number one, just as we're starting for all of this, is figuring out at the beginning, why are you, whoops, oh, that should have been up while I was giving the last part of that talk. But yeah, better decisions make better games. But question number one, straight up, is why are you, the person listening to this, interested in making this particular game or this particular tech project that you're on? And this comes down to a lot of knowing what your own personal goal is. Is this for your career? Is it to make money? Is it to get famous? Is it to learn something on a project or maybe build up a reputation? And this is really something you should know. And this helps you define, are you currently doing the job that you should be doing in the game industry? Or maybe you're coming in, you're like, man, I don't want to be doing this now, but this is what I'm doing to help get me a promotion that gets me into the right thing. Or this is my first job in the industry that lets me then get hired at a big studio after that. But if you're like, hey, I'm doing this as a career, what are you looking to do it as? Are you coming in as an artist, a designer, an engineer, a producer, QA, audio? Are you wanting to be a cinematographer within games or be doing the composition and the score, doing localization, doing marketing? There's a lot of different goals around this. And so figuring out why you're doing what you're doing is very important, along with knowing why is your company making this particular game or this particular product. And for a lot of cases, game companies make games because this is how they make money. You design a game, and then hopefully that game sells well, gets you the money, and you can go make your next game. So this could just be for that, but it could also be a contract job. Other teams get hired to make a game, and it doesn't matter how well the game does other than maybe royalties. Their job is to make the game, not necessarily to make their own game. But it could also be that, maybe you're Unreal coming in or Epic coming in with the Unreal Engine, and you're making a game not to show off your cool game, but to show off how cool your engine is. Or maybe you're looking to build up a team rep to, once you've made a cool game, that gets you enough reputation to go and make your next bigger game. This is a stepping stone to get you a bigger budget. Or you're coming in and you don't even care if you make money on it. You just want to break even because you're establishing a new IP or a new brand or intellectual property. Or maybe you're an art house coming in and you want to make the best art game that you can. Each of these are different goals. And because of that, you're making a different game or showing off different kinds of things depending what your goal is. Because sometimes the money isn't the primary goal, But again, if you don't know why you're making the game, and this game in particular, you're not going to know if you've achieved your goal. You don't know your win condition. And working in games is very, and technology is very much about knowing what is your win condition. So again, question number one to answer before you're in a project is, why are you making this game? Both you yourself and you, your company. And this is what helps you figure out, are you making the thing that's going to win? And so number two is, what is the game that you're making? And let's start with the real basics here, that in a lot of cases, many companies I've talked to don't necessarily, some people know what they're making, but not everybody knows what they're making. When I gave this talk at PAX Dev, there was a room probably of 500 or 600 developers in the room. And I said, hey, how many here know what game you're working on? Or excuse me, how many of you are working on a game? And everybody raised their hand. And I said, how many of you know what game you're working on? Everybody kept their hand raised. And I said, okay, so let's talk about it. Because somebody on your team knows all of this, but do you know the following? So can you tell me, and this again, this could be games or a tech project, what is your game's elevator pitch? So your elevator pitch is the quick description of the game. This is kind of what sells the game. An elevator pitch is from, if you got into an elevator at a trade show and maybe there's somebody really famous there who can help finance your game, and you're just riding in the elevator, so you have 30 seconds or less, do you know how you could pitch your game in such a good way that they'd be like, hey, here's my card, send me an email, let's talk more about this later? That's the elevator pitch. Or the vision of your game. This is the heart of the game. The vision directs all aspects of design. Or the core concepts, the major groupings of all the integrated systems of the games and the motifs that show up through the game's character, its body. Or the core loops, what do players do in the game and how do you return them to an equilibrium state? Or genre, what's the genre? And this is really important for selling or telling people about the game. Are you making a shooter, a racing game? Are you making a platformer, survival horror? All of these things kind of help inform the art style, the mechanics, the core features. Do you know your game's age rating? In the US, this would be ESRB. In Europe, this would be PEGI. This is, what kind of content is appropriate for your game? Do you know the setting? What's the time period or the literary genre of the game, or the location, or the art style? What does it look like? What are the concept art? What are the spreadsheets? Is your game multiplayer? Is it online co-op skirmish? Do you have the infrastructure to support it? Do you have matchmaking? Do you have chat systems? And more. Kind of all of these cohesively, these should be cohesive and complementary. All elements of a game or any project should work together to make a really strong and a really tight user experience. And so the question is, as you're working at any part, do you know all of these things? And at PAX Dev, when I gave this talk, I said, okay, for the audience where everybody just had their hand up, who here knows all of this? And I think 2 or 3 people of the 500 or 600 had their hands up. And it wasn't that people on their team didn't know it. It was that different people on different members of their team knew different parts, and it wasn't disseminated as well as it needed to be. And this is basically, if your team doesn't know all this, you don't actually fully know what you're building, which means that you might be building it wrong. So a great example, one of my sister teams at a company, they were working on a mature rated kind of urban game, or set in an urban environment. And the art team, for some reason, didn't know that it was going to get a mature ESRB rating, meaning 17 and older. Excuse me, they thought it was going to be mature. The game was actually rated teen. And so that meant this had to be appropriate for 13 and older. Art team thought it was 17 and older. So in all of the urban subway stations and on some of the walls, they had all this graffiti. And as they were doing a cleanup pass near the end, they realized that the graffiti was definitely R-rated graffiti and not teen-rated graffiti. And they had to spend, I think, 4 or 5 months of man time going back and removing all of this graffiti and replacing it with other things when they could have been doing other art and adding more to the game. And this was just because that one piece of information wasn't conveyed to the team and led to an entirely wrong approach on how they implemented part of the art in the game. And this is, again, just kind of knowing what the game is or what your tech project is can save you so much time and can make the game so much better simply by figuring out, how do you share this information? And as an example, every design doc I do always actually lists all of this on the front page of every document, just like a little one pager to remind people for everything they look at, here is all of the bones of the project. This is what we're working on. So number 3 is, who is the game, or who is your tech, or who is your product for? And let's start with this question. Do you think that the same people who play My Little Pony, Pinkie Pie's Party also play Halo? Or do you think that the same people who play Farmville play Plants vs. Zombies and play Dota? And do you think that people playing these games have the same amount of time, say session length, to play these games? Or will pay, say, the same amount for a game upfront versus in, say, in-game transactions? Or will they even do in-game transactions? Does your audience play online games? Do they play offline games? Do they play co-op games? What art style do they like? This is all really important stuff, and stuff that we almost all don't think about when we should, which is at the start of a project rather than, say, halfway through development. And knowing who your game is for, kind of who your audience is really important, because you're talking about your audience. Are they sci-fi fans? What's their demographics? Age, gender, ethnicity, location. What kinds of things do they like? Where do they live? Do you need localization? What kinds of devices do they use? Are you making something that they want to play? Will they like it? Because you could make a My Little Pony game that I would enjoy, but you shouldn't, because I'm not the right audience for it. And if you're a professional in the video game industry or just in tech in general, you should be making the best possible games for the audience that the game is for. And this is important. This is the audience that the game is for. You're not making the game that you want to necessarily play. The game you're making may not be the game you want to play, but it should be the best possible game for the audience, best possible game for the audience that the game is intended for. And I met a lot of dev teams that were really hard at work making the game they wanted to play, but not the game that their audience wanted to play. And this often leads to games that have very poor sales or end up getting canceled before release, because they'll do a test run at the audience and realize that this isn't the right game to finish spending the money on for development. So this kind of comes down to, is this the right game, right for the market? Is this game good enough? If you also look kind of on the time, team, and budget. For example, if you're going out right now trying to put out a budget shooter game, I would say good luck. There is so much competition between Call of Duty and the Halos and the Team Fortresses and just, all of the different amazing shooter games out there, that if you're trying to go budget going head to head against them, you're not going to win, short of something wildly innovative. Or say you have a $200 million development budget. So, somewhere on the level of, actually, that's a little less than the budget of like a Grand Theft Auto. But, you have a S-tier development budget, and you're going to go make, say, a Dukes of Hazzard licensed game. That's also an awful choice. You're never going to make $200 million off of that license. You're putting the wrong budget for the wrong type of game. And so a lot of this is you're figuring out who is the game for, who is your audience, helps you figure out what is the kind of thing that you're putting out, and will that align with the audience versus everything else out there? And that's a really important decision, because if you choose poorly, if you do not choose the right thing on that, you're going to end up making a game for an audience where this just isn't the correct game for the audience. And that makes it really hard. The next thing to really think about on this is, where is the game going to be playable? And this is a really interesting question, because this is a couple of questions. For example, on what platform? Is this a game for the Xbox? Is this a game for the PlayStation? Is this a game for mobile? Is this, hit that slide too quickly. Platforms are really important for a number of reasons, including how you code the game, the interface, the controls, the networking capability. But it's also important for your audience to say, are you on these platforms? And for knowing things like session length, say iPhone versus Xbox. If you're designing a mobile phone game, almost all mobile phone games run in 3-minute increment loops, because they know that people playing on mobile are often doing it between other things. You're waiting online, you're riding the bus, you're sitting on the toilet. Toilet's actually the third or fourth most common place to be playing mobile games. And so you're also looking for, where is it playable for platform, graphical fidelity, storage space. That if you're making a game on the Xbox, people want to play it for 45 minutes plus at a time. They're looking for a level of graphical fidelity. They're looking for a different control scheme than if you're playing a game on an iPhone, or if you're playing it in VR, or if you're playing a game in a browser. So knowing where your game is playable, in addition to things like genre, making a shooter game on a mobile device is very different than making it on a Xbox or PlayStation or console, and that's different than making it in VR. It's the same genre of game, but it's a different execution based on platform. And this is part of an interesting question too for knowing if your audience is there. For example, do you know how many console titles? So console would be like Xbox, PlayStation, Wii, or Switch at this point. Do you know how many console titles Disney used to release and how many they do now? So Disney used to release a whole bunch of console titles, and now they release zero because they know that their audience has shifted to other platforms. They're now all on basically mobile tablet because parents just hand me down their kids' phones, and that's where all of Disney's games now get played. So knowing where your audience is really important. Knowing where it's playable, knowing if your audience will play an online game or an offline game is very critical to figure out before you actually start building the thing. Same with tech projects. And kind of the other version is where is it playable is looking at the regions. So for example, knowing is this game popular in this kind of region? There's a lot of Japanese RPGs that are really well received in Japan that get almost no play anywhere else in the world. And there's a lot of Chinese free-to-play games that just nobody plays outside of China. There's different ways that people engage with them. And kind of knowing what you're designing, are you designing a worldwide game? Are you designing a game that's focused on a particular region? That's really important to know. It also tells you, are you going to need a language lookup table? Are you going to need localized iconography? Is your art, say, offensive in some regions? For example, if you're putting a game out and you want it to ship in Germany, you can't have red blood or depictions of Nazis. If you want to launch your game in France, you need to have French as a language option. If you're going to launch in China, you can't call it the Sea of Japan. It has to be the Sea of China. Do you want nudity in your game? Well, you probably can't sell it in most places in the US. Do you have the ability to sell in different stores with different currencies in different regions? Maybe looking for a localization partner is suddenly a lot more interesting. And for those of you, for this is kind of your first time looking at it, there's a difference between localization and regionalization. Localization is where you basically go from one language to another. You're like, hey, I want my game to be in English and in Japanese and in German and in French. Regionalization is looking at some of the different cultural aspects of it and looking at what parts of your game need to be changed to sell better or to even be allowable in those regions. So some games get localized, some games get regionalized, and some games get both. But again, this is a very important thing to think about because if you have to go and put this back in later, it can be a lot of work. A great example of this is in the Fallout series. There was the Sacred Bremen who is wandering around big cow-like thing. And one of my friends who's a cultural advisor, Kate Edwards, she was the head of the IGDA for a while, was talking to the studio and she's like, hey, if you want to be able to sell your game in India, you cannot have this in. If you can shoot and kill it, they're going to ban your game. And they said, oh, we don't think it's that big of a deal. And they put out the game. It was banned in India and they lost access to millions and millions of people who could have bought their game because they picked one thing that they could have easily changed and didn't pay attention to this. And so knowing, again, where your game will be playable both on platform and in regions is really interesting for designing what kind of game you're making. Next one, and this is a really interesting one, is, hey, when's your game going to come out? And this is in some cases kind of a trick question because knowing the release date is a really interesting thing. But a lot of this kind of works also on the milestones. So for example, on your initial release date, is this for all your platforms? If you're making a game that comes out on the Xbox, the PlayStation, the Switch, iOS, Android, is your release date the same for all of those? For all the platforms, for all the regions? Are you releasing your localized Japanese version later? Because even if you're doing the later releases, letting your programming team know, for example, that you also want a PC version in addition to your console version saves a lot of time because you architect the game or the technology differently. And this is kind of the same along the major milestones. Um, when's your prototype? When's your first playable? When's your alpha? When's your beta? When's your release? And actually, a really great trick that a lot of production teams use is they count backwards. So they say, okay, we have enough money for 24 months of development with our team, 2 years. We're going to release this game 2 years from now. We have 24 months. We want 3 months for beta because we want to use all that time for polish. Okay, so that's 21 months away. And they say, we need 2 months for alpha. Okay, we're 19 months away. And we think it's going to take us 3 months to prototype this game. So at that point, we went, okay, 24 months, 21 months, 19 months, 3 months of prototype. So we are going to have 16 months of development time after 3 months of prototyping, 2 months of alpha, 3 months of beta. And you counting backwards, you can then say, is this enough time to make the game? And this is where you can then look at your schedule. And this is where a really good producer or product manager helps in. Because you might realize now that you have 10 years worth of man art to do, but only 6 years worth of artist time available. And that's a great thing to know at the beginning rather than say halfway through, because otherwise this is bad scheduling. And this is what leads to crunch in the video game industry. And if you're going to crunch, you should be crunching on purpose, not by accident. And this is also what gives you time to polish. And polish is what turns a really good game into an amazing game and turns an okay program into a killer app. And the teams that kind of lose, if you're time crunched, the thing that you always lose is you lose the time to polish. And this is where kind of scoping out your game or your tech project is amazingly important. Because if you realize you have this much time and this much game, you're going to either have to cut some game or you're going to have to crunch at the end and it's not going to be polished. And the difference between polished and not polished is almost unmeasurable on how well the game does. Unpolished games just do not do well, or tech projects, compared to polished, tighter, more cohesive versions in there. But kind of going along with this as well of, when will this game come out, is this also lets you know when you're going to need your supporting teams. So for example, when do you need to engage your audio team or your marketing team or your QA, your quality assurance team, your customer support team, your localization, your UA, your user acquisition? Knowing when you need to get these, or when your publisher gets them for you, can help you plan for the early needs rather than having all of these show up at the end. And so, for example, if you're like, hey, we're talking to marketing, our game is 2 years out, we're going to have 2 E3s and 2 PAXs before then that we're going to show up at, we know that our marketing team is going to need demos of the game for all of those. And demos don't just appear, you have to build them. So this gives you time to schedule in, hey, we need to build this. Or maybe your art team needs to be producing extra art assets for the marketing team to be promoting. Or you need to have all of your dialogue done so you can get it to your localization team. Kind of knowing when each of these happen is really important to kind of scheduling out what are you building. And each of the groups I mentioned is really, really important. And honestly, just especially marketing, because an amazing game that nobody hears about is a game that just doesn't get bought. And I can talk more about that after if we want for the time, but figuring out the promotion for your game, what makes people want to get it and how you spread that around is almost as important as having a really good game. So next thing to kind of talk about is how much does it cost to make the game? And this is talking about a couple of things. And the most common of which is, hey, what's the budget for the game? So for video games and a lot of technology, the most of the budget, usually like 90% of the budget, is the people who actually make the games, called headcount. And so if you ever want a quick and dirty, how much did this game cost to make? The IGDA does a game developer survey every year where they track budgets. And they can tell you what on average does a junior artist versus a regular or a senior artist earn versus say an engineer or a game designer or QA. So if you ever want to know, you can actually just go look at a game's credits, look at all of the people, look at their position titles, take it against that survey, and you can add up very quickly This is the rough cost in people. Like, okay, I heard this game took 3 years to make. It had 200 people. Here's all of the people. Here's their budgets. And then roughly add about 50% onto that for the budget, because that's also going to cover payroll taxes and healthcare and getting an office and buying computers and all of that kind of game. And this is a great way too, as you're kind of looking at other things to figure out scope wise, are you making more game than you have budget for? Just looking at the number of people. And this is where a really good producer is important, because if you have more game to make than money and time to make it, there's going to be problems. And kind of going along with this then is also, okay, that's the budget, but what's the real budget? You know, are you hooking up with a publisher? Do you need to do marketing? Do you need to go to trade shows? Do you need to build up server infrastructure? And this lets you know the answer to the next really important question, which is, can this game or tech project be profitable? And this is kind of the cost of the game versus game sales. And remember when we said this was a business? And do you know what happens to businesses that spend more money than they take in? You know, it's pretty simple math. They go out of business. So if you're looking at a game, you're like, hey, this game is going to cost us $10 million to make, and we're going to be selling it in the Apple store. So they're going to take 30% of the cost, and we have a publisher, you know, helping us with the funds. They're going to take 20% of that. You can very quickly figure out how much of your game do you need to sell before you break even. And of course, most studios don't want to just break even. They want to hopefully earn a lot more money to fund their next game or to fund their next tech project. And so thinking about how much it costs to make your game or your tech project is critically important, because that's what lets you kind of start doing the math of saying, are we making a thing that we can make money on, or are we making a thing that's going to put us out of business because it costs more to make than we're going to make back? So kind of going along with this on the how much does it cost, the next part is knowing, hey, how do you make money on your game? Or how do you monetize? And there's a lot of different ways to monetize in the video game industry nowadays, which is, you know, you could be making a premium game, a game they buy. You can be making a free-to-play game with microtransactions or ad revenue or a subscription-based game or a game that sells and has extra DLC that keeps adding on. But knowing how your game or how your tech project makes money is really important. For example, if this is a premium game, a sell and done game, no online, no anything else, that's one thing. But if this is a game as a service, you also have the really interesting steps of making sure that, you know, number one, is your game good enough? Because people don't actually spend money on games that they don't like. Or, you know, is this a thing that people want to buy in the game if you're doing, say, microtransactions? And do they feel that it was good value? Have you priced it well when you buy it? Otherwise, they won't buy it again. Great example. So I played League of Legends, as I said, for over 5 years. I've probably spent about $1,000 on League of Legends, but I also played it for 5 years for about 2 hours a day. And I did the math once and figured out that even off that, I was spending like 10 or 15 cents an hour for entertainment. And I was like, oh, that's fine. That is pretty good value for money. But it was also that every time I bought something in League, I felt that the value was worthwhile. I was playing a free-to-play Star Wars mobile game a bit ago, and the first thing I bought, it felt so undervalued for what I got versus what I paid that I was so soured on it, I never spent money on it again, even though I played it for another couple months. And so kind of knowing how you make money off of it. And the next one is then, does your audience monetize this way? So for example, are you making a free-to-play game for 8-year-olds where you're hoping for whale spending habits? That just doesn't happen. 8-year-olds don't have credit cards. If they're spending money, it's money that mommy and daddy approve. Or are you making, say, a $60 premium spot the hidden object game targeting middle-aged housewives? Again, you're not pricing or making the right thing. You can absolutely make a premium game for that, but the price structure is different. And you may laugh saying hidden object game for middle-aged housewives, but that is $100 million plus market right there. There's a tremendous amount of money being made on that by people who know how to make those well. And that's one of the great things about the video game industry right now, is that it has gotten so broad with so many types of games that you can make games for very different large audiences and small audiences. And it's just about making the game that resonates with your audience and kind of picking the right kind of game on the right platform that monetizes the right way with the right subject matter, finding that right niche is what lets you make the thing that's successful. And kind of going on that, another thing to know is, are you done when you ship? So, for example, we put out Catan in virtual reality, and it's a multiplayer Catan. It's actually a friggin' fantastic game, but we're sell once. We don't have microtransactions. You buy the game. But then we have servers that we're leaving up basically indefinitely. So part of us pricing the game was figuring out how much of the game's money that we're bringing in are we devoting to paying for server costs for, say, the next 5 or 10 years, because we need the servers up and online so that people can play Catan and VR multiplayer against each other. And that just had to be part of the equation revenue because it's one of the core features of the game. And you obviously should be making money once you ship the game, but then you get into other things too. For example, it's not like Apple or Steam pays you the day you make money. Some of those have a net 30 or a net 45 days where Apple gets to sit on the money for a certain amount of time until they pay it out to you. So if you're just coasting across the finish line with your game and you get there and you have $0 in your bank and your game launches, you actually might go out of business before you get your first amount of money in. You guys have probably all heard about dev studios that launch their game and then lay off, say, 90% of their staff. This is usually because they were coasting across the finish line with no money in the bank, ship the game, and then realize that they just don't have salary to pay people for the next month or 2 or 3 up until the sales of the game. That money comes back to them. And you might need, you probably don't need the super fine details of monetization at the beginning of making your game or your product, but knowing how you're going to monetize is very important because it's an essential part of the game's DNA. Making a free-to-play game is different than making a premium game. Making a game that you're going to keep adding on DLC packs is very different from making a one and done. And again, these are just important things to know because it dictates how you make the game and the features and the art and the execution, everything around that. So point number 8 is, how will your game stand out? So remember when I said that a lot of games come out, that 100,000 plus in this last year, if you count console and mobile and everything together. So in that, you have to know, what is your USP, your unique sales proposition? This is basically what makes your game stand out. If you're kind of buying like an actual, say, console game, this is a lot of what gets put on the back of the box when you're looking in the 3 or 4 bullet points. We're like, hey, what makes God of War feel different than Halo or Little Big Planet or Animal Crossing? What are these games, kind of the unique sales proposition? What are they selling you? What's the cool part of it? And then it's, how do you leverage that? So how do you take the USP, the unique part of your game, and leverage that to get more people to notice you? And then you kind of also have to ask, is the USP really the thing that helps make your game distinct? Because not everything has to be unique, but what is you really want to capitalize on? So for example, Blizzard is very famous for not having really, their USP is, we will take things that other people have done and give you a really highly polished version of that. Where you get other companies that they're kind of there and they have very unique feeling games or games that feel very different. And again, there's different ways to skew on this, but knowing what are the differentiating factors of your game helps you really focus on that. And it also helps you think about, are you spending time being unique in ways that nobody's going to care about? And if so, why are you doing that? If you're making a shooter game and you're spending a ton of time focusing on part of the game that shooter fans won't care about just to be unique, that's probably wasting time. You should be spending kind of your hard brain innovation time on something that will engage more with the core part of the audience. And this also kind of goes to part of your USP, part of what makes it interesting is, this is what marketing or promotion is going to use to engage your audience. And this is important because if you don't hear about it, you won't buy it. And actually, I'll even talk about it for a moment here. Back when I used to run my research company, we did a study at one point on marketing versus game quality. In other words, one side of the graph was, how much money did you spend on marketing or promotion? The other side was, how good was your game? And what we did was we divided these all into kind of big buckets of, bottom third marketing, middle third, top third marketing, bottom third quality, middle third, top third. and we tossed out all the middles. So that gave us 4 big buckets. Games that were high quality with big market spend. This is where you want to be. Then there's, of course, games with low marketing and low quality, the thing you really hope you're not. So if we got rid of those, we're left with 2 buckets. Games that spent a ton on marketing but had poor quality, and games that were really high quality but spent very little on marketing. And when you looked at the sales for those, you realized that the games with the high marketing but low quality drastically oversold the high quality games with no marketing. And this was because if nobody hears about your game, no matter how good it is, they're not going to get it. And as a developer who spent over 20 years doing this breaks my heart. You'd want to think that the really good stuff just rises to the top. But there is so much out there now that just very rarely happens anymore. That's called getting lucky. And getting lucky is a bad thing to bet your studio on. And so part of, the ability to promote and to market is the ability to have things about your game or your product that really stand out, that are the thing that your audience you're making it for, the thing that they care about. And it's vitally important. And it's a thing that you, no matter what you are, the artist, the designer, the engineer, the producer, can be thinking about and making sure that your team is focusing on those. Because that's what's going to get shown. That's what people are going to see in the cinematics and the trailers and the demos. When a YouTube personality picks it up, an influencer, or, when you're showing it off at the trade show. It's just, that's the things people tend to notice, your USP, your unique sales proposition. And this is actually a little bit different than you say, we have that, but then actually, what are the key features of my game or my product? Which features are critical to the game being fun? And, is this the game's persistence? Is it the co-op, the progression, the combat, the story? And these are all things to concentrate on. But the big thing is, it isn't like every single one of these is the most critical. Identifying the critical thing is like for a tech project, being able to say, what are the key features that are really important about this? What are the things we need to concentrate on to make this a really standout game? And there's a really good example. If you've ever heard of the game Civilization, they're on Civ 6 now, one of my favorite games. In the very original Civilization, the lead designer, Sid Meier, he was working with the team. And if you remember in the very first game, you could lay mines around your city. And the AI was just stupid. It would just keep walking into the mines. And they're having a really hard time balancing how to have mines be effective versus kind of the intelligence level of the AI on what was effective and what wasn't. And at a certain point, Sid Meier just said, hey, we're cutting this feature. Nobody is playing a Civilization game because they care about putting mines in front of their city. We're spending way too much time on a thing that is not a key feature in our game. So they just chopped it out, and the game was better for it. One of my favorite ones I've ever done is I came on to work on an RTS as one of the senior design staff, a real-time strategy game. And this was one that they were looking at having classes in there. And it was an online game. It's like, are you playing as the general? Or are you playing as the propagandist or the scientist? So these each had influences, and the general influenced the units where everybody else influenced the other things. And they were having a really hard time balancing the combat. And I just looked at that and remembered Sid Meier and said, hey, we're going to chop the general class. And suddenly there was no class that was better at combat. So the combat portion of the game suddenly all played well. And all of the other things like the science and the propaganda and the others were specialties that went on top of it, and the game worked. So kind of looking at what is a key feature, what is important to your game, and in that case, combat was more important. But what is the important part that makes it shine, and being able to kind of push aside the other things. And when you're looking at what's critical to the game being fun, you also have to say really, because you have to take a hard look at your list and your budget. And I've been making games for over 20 years. No team ever got everything they wanted in a game. No tech product ever got everything they wanted in the product. It's just, it doesn't happen. There's always more stuff you want in than you have time and money to do it. And so what this means is you need a prioritized list. You need to be able to look at this and say, wait, we think these are all key, but do we really need all of them? If you're assuming you can't get everything you want in, what are the most important things? And are these important things the same as your USP? What makes your game stand out? And should they be? And if not, why are you spending so much time on them? Again, this is all just stuff that if you can think about this and lay this out kind of at the beginning, the important parts, and reassess, this is what keeps your game or your project on time, on production, and lets you make the really amazing thing that hopefully later gets sold and makes you guys all a ton of money. And then you go, you make your next amazing thing. And so number 10, and then we'll start chatting, pick up some questions, is figuring out who's the team, which is, and this kind of then goes to, do you have the right people to make this game? You know, are you making a historical sim? Okay, who's your history person? Are you making a Lord of the Rings game? Okay, who's your Tolkien expert? Are you making an arcade style fighter? Okay, who's your pro tournament level fighter peep? You know, an RTS. Okay, who's your amazing AI and pathfinding engineer? Because part of making a game is getting the right people to make the game and hiring for the important parts of the game, the USP and the key features, and kind of figuring out for these people, you know, back before pandemic, you know, where are they? Do you need an entirely local team? Do you need a remote team? Can you hybrid them? Do you need everybody long-term? Can some of them be hired guns? And when do you need them? You know, do you need to bring on senior people at the beginning and more junior people later? And do you need all of them? Because, for example, if you bring on people before they can work, so say you're, you know, fleshing out part of your engine and you need to get your level designer tool up and working. Why are you bringing on the level designers before you have the tools that you can use to build it? You know, maybe you're bringing them into prototype, or are you getting the character modelers? Do you have all of your concept art done so that people can start modeling characters? And a good example of this, when I put together my last studio experiment 7, because we had a limited amount of time to get our first game out, we only hired senior people at the beginning because we knew they would be able to start working the quickest. And over time, we started bringing on mid-level and more junior people as we were able to stretch our time from start to finish out longer. And it was just choices based on what kind of game we needed to get out and the time frame we had. And kind of going along with this is, do you have the right support? You know, if you're a dev team, do you have a publisher? You know, have you found voice actors, a server staff, celebrities? Are they located? You know, figuring out who your team is, who your support is, and when you bring them on is also, again, really critical. And all of this, you know, just backing up for a second, this is all planning. This is logistics. Most people don't get into game design or tech because they want to sit through and think about logistics and answer the questions. But this is just something that, having been doing this for more than 20 years, it's the teams who can figure this out at the beginning and the teams who can think about it. They're the ones who just, they increase their chance of being successful. Their games succeed much more often. And making games is really hard work, but, you know, creating them, for honestly, for me, brings me a lot of personal joy. And that being said, it can also be, you know, it can be hell, but planning the games can make some, but not all of that kind of hell part of the job go away. So hopefully this is something that's been useful that you can think about, you know, next time you're on a game jam, you're talking to your professors, talk about kind of all of the production that goes along with all of the stuff for making the project, because this is part of what lets you, you know, make a game, go take over the world, and have that kick-ass thing that then everybody wants to talk about. And it's like, oh yeah, you worked on that game. And that's what gets you onto your next big team with your next cool project. And hopefully is then something that long-term gets you in the position that you want to be, to maybe start your own studio or plan your own game from scratch as opposed to coming on somebody else's. But thanks. I'll stop sharing, and hopefully we'll hop in and do a little Q&A here. And
Yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you so much, Geoffrey. I'm pretty sure you're getting a whole bunch of virtual rounds of applause right now, because that was super incredible. Lots of things that, I'll be honest, I've never even thought about and are obviously super important to the industry.
Nobody thinks about this at the beginning. That's the fun part. I didn't. Well, excuse me, maybe not nobody. I sure didn't, but it's just the things that over time.
Definitely.
Do you want to read some questions?
Yes.
All right.
That would be awesome. So our first question is coming from Austin. So what is the advantage of releasing games in the alpha or beta stages?
So usually on that, let's see. So there's almost, the biggest advantage is that you get feedback early on, and that And it's a tricky part. I'll talk about the pros and cons of it. So most people, when they're going to play a game, are going to play something for fun. And that means that you kind of want the most polished experience you can get. That they're not usually looking to come on and help you beta test or alpha, define your bugs. Alpha is almost always designed as every key feature of the game is in, even if it's not finished, meaning that you can mostly play through the game. The beta is where kind of everything's in and is in a mostly finished state. And at this point, you're kind of polishing and iterating. And you're like, oh, well, this is broken. We should fix this. This requires a couple new art things. So you only let your friends and family kind of in during alpha. You try to never show it to the general public during alpha because your game's not ready to show at alpha. Beta, you will often let a limited number of beta testers in, and their job is to kind of play through the game, because honestly, as you're building the game, at a certain point, you can't tell certain things anymore. Does this take too long? Is it fun? Because you've done it a lot. And your QA is very good at spotting bugs and things that are wrong, but their job isn't necessarily to say, is this fun? Their job is to say, is this working or not? And so a beta test lets you get outside feedback and also see, are they bumping into things that you never thought of? Are they playing the game in weird ways that you're like, oh, well, we didn't think of this, but this is cool. Let's add more of that. But part of the problem is almost everybody who opts into a beta is still expecting a finished product if they're a consumer. So most teams don't actually release their beta until they're like a couple of iterations into beta, and they think this is pretty well tuned. Let's see what a crowd thinks now. Because also people start doing reviews based on your beta. They get their first impression. And if you have a beta that's awful, everybody's first impression is awful and you lose all your momentum for the game you're putting out. And I have seen this happen to teams and it sucks. But so that's kind of advantages and disadvantages.
Awesome, thank you. Let's see. Our next question is coming from Satya. So do you see premium games moving towards being subscription-based to combat the increasing complexities and costs from things such as keeping expensive servers running?
I think it depends on the game. There's certain games that people will it's a really hard value proposition that if it's like a semi-static game, to be like, I think you need a subscription to access our multiplayer feature. And that's really hard. That basically, there's a couple schools of thought, but the biggest one is these are now called games as a service. So you either think of your game as we release it and it's mostly done. Maybe we put out a couple of patches, or this is a game that we intend to service over a long period of time. Fortnite, League of Legends, every Call of Duty, or even other games like Slay the Spire, one of my personal favorite games, is not a game as a service, but it kind of is. They've sold enough copies that they can keep doing patches and adding extra characters and other things that take development time that they're not getting extra people to pay for, but they're keeping their audience so happy that their audience keeps recommending the game and playing the game. And then they tell their friends, more people buy it. So that's kind of another version, but that's also a very small team. That's a studio that had under 10 people. And I think it was 2 people that made the original game. So part of it's your dev cost, how expensive it is to maintain a team and what you want to do going forward. And so I think that there will indeed be more games that try a subscription model, or even a model like Civ 6. Civ 6 does it by they keep releasing expansions. It's like, or, they have, you can buy a season pass and get all of the expansions, or you can buy them individually. You can buy individual extra leader packs. Like I think they just put out Kubla Khan and a Vietnamese leader I'd have to go look up. And it's like, oh, do I want to go buy a couple new leaders I could play the game as? They cost them X amount of development time to do that, but that then pays for all of their multiplayer servers and everything else as people continue to buy pieces of the game. And so it's really about finding the right strategy for the kind of game you're making. And sadly, there isn't this one thing works for everybody. If there was, every game company would be doing it. But because there isn't, that's why you kind of see such differences across the industry.
Awesome, thank you. So we are bumping into 2 o'clock here. If it's all right with you, we'd love to answer a few more questions.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So next up is a fun one. What's your favorite edition of D&D?
Oh man, This we could talk about for a while. I will say, in the interest of brevity, I think fifth edition is my favorite for, which is the one we're currently on, for as a game designer, for cleanliness and integration of rules, and for their polish pass and amount of inclusivity they have. I have appreciated every single version of D&D. Probably my least favorite is fourth edition, um, which we could do a whole talk on. But I think from a design polish, and at my heart, I am a systems designer. I'm the person who's tinkering with all the numbers and the balance and putting it together. I think fifth is the cleanest version that is accessible to the most amount of people. But and so because of that, as a game designer, it's my favorite.
That's fair enough. Let's see. Next up from Irene. So what are some good careers in the gaming industry for someone who is a CS or tech oriented, besides some of the obvious ones like programming?
So there are four big disciplines of game production, and they are basically game designers, the people who do everything from level design to content, that's like story and quests, to system design, which is all of the balancing and spreadsheets, and experience design, which is how do you jump? How does the controller rumble? You know, all the experience around it. So there's design, lots of documentation. There's art, which is everything from animation to characters to illustration, just everything put together. Engineering, programming, which is everything from tools to engine to visual effects to networking. And then there's the production, the producer, and kind of the people who do all the scheduling. Those are the four biggest disciplines. If you're then there's also QA, which isn't necessarily part of the development side, but is a tool that the development side uses in the same way that you also use the audio team and the localization, all of these different specialties that come in. But if you really like the tech, engineer is obviously one of them. And if so, I would encourage you to kind of get as much computer science as you can, as well as game engine, because games are always looking for new things. If you happen to like art as well, people who are tech savvy and can make tools to help the art production pipeline get into the game are some of the single hardest people to find in the game industry. Somebody who understands both all of, how does everything from Photoshop to Maya and everything work, and can make tools to help the artists get it into the game. That kind of programmer is just gold. If you're good at that, you have a job, just always. People who are really good at integrating with the testing of the game. So an engineer who's also good at designing test suites and test automation are also people that are highly in demand. But even like if you like managing people, going on a production side, being good at scheduling while knowing how all the tech works, actually pretty much tech will get you anywhere. Like I'm a game designer who's decently technical, but you would never want me to go set up your servers or your databases or other things. But I can program a couple of scripting languages. I can work in databases. That makes me a better designer. So any amount of tech skills will make you better at anything you do. But yeah, game programmers are always in demand. People who are good at scripting languages, people who are good at tools, people who can integrate with art, people who can integrate with QA are probably like some of the top things I'd name. And if there's a follow-up to make it more precise, I can do that. But
yeah, those are some really interesting opportunities, actually. Let's see. We'll keep moving on for now. Next up, so what would you say is a growing game genre right now? For example, a few years ago, battle royales were really on the rise.
There's always going to be new kinds of things. Roguelites are, there's a lot of people doing roguelites right now. A lot of people still every once in a while kicking off a new MOBA. UGC, user-generated content-focused games, like things that you kind of graduate from Roblox to. I've seen a couple of companies really, like the Core team or Manticore has a couple cool offerings around there. It's interesting. We have, there's so many new games just with all the tools coming out, or even just co-op-y style games that you can play across the internet, like Among Us and what's the silly little one where you get all the little guys running the hundreds at a time? name will come back to me. But it's just, we're actually kind of in a
Fall Guys.
renaissance. Sorry, what?
It's like Fall Guys, right?
Fall Guys, thank
Oh,
you.
guys, yes.
Yeah, my brain was just doing the, but one of the great parts about the industry right now is it is so diverse on the types of games that people appreciate, and the audience has grown so much that I think we're going to continue to see trends in games as new things pop up, but it's not like any of the old ones are going away. People still love their civilizations, and people still love their little Clash of Clans base building games, or their hidden object games that were popular 20 years ago and are still popular, and they're Bejeweled. I mean, we just kind of keep adding things and expanding, and people like all of those, which is good. So I can't think of anything that I'm like, I think this is the one thing that's going to blow up in a couple of years, but I think we're going to see a lot of stuff that's popular now even continue to be more so.
Yeah, and then sort of as a follow-up, another question we have. So like in the case of Among Us, do you believe it got popular merely because it got lucky with publicity?
Yes.
Because it was genuinely, yes.
So it was a good game. I mean, don't get me wrong, but the team was already working on Among Us 2 because Among Us just never got much traction. And they had that, they had the don't bet your company on it thing, which is they had, which influencer was it? A big influencer, I can't remember who, streamed the game, and people were like, oh, that looks cool. And suddenly that one, it's like when PewDiePie paid Angry Birds. I mean, not Angry Birds, man, my brain is off today. Flappy Bird. And suddenly the game shot up to #1 because everybody was like, oh, this game looks awful, but it looks fun. And even people who didn't like games were downloading and playing the game. And it's getting lucky is a really bad thing to bet your whole game's future on. But I think for a lot of it is Among Us was a small team with no marketing and promotion budget. And they had a really hard time until people saw the game played saying, why is this game fun? And what it took was a couple of popular people playing the game to show, why is this game fun? And the kind of game they did, it was actually some of the very hardest to promote, because a game that you can't show somebody the fun in like a 20 or 30 or 40-second clip is a really hard game to kind of promote.
Yeah, it seems like it was quite a gamble on their part that paid off big time.
Well, but I mean, they'd already, not to be funny, I won't say given up on it. They were making the sequel. They stopped making the sequel and the game blew up and just said, we're going to add all this stuff from the sequel in and just keep supporting this. Where they'd thought their game had done okay, but not well enough. So they were working on the next version. So I think it surprised them as much, if not more so, than everybody else.
Caught everyone off guard, that one did.
Yeah, which is great.
Exactly. Keeps us entertained. Let's see. What is your favorite League champion? And do you like the art direction that Riot is going in with League of Legends?
I think their art direction is actually phenomenal. The readability of their characters. Readability is, you can look at a picture of them, but when you're playing the game, you're at that zoomed out isometric view where you're looking down from, 100-foot height, a high height. And readability is being able to look and immediately identify every character when you see them. Because they have more than, I think, 150 characters at this point. And the fact that they all also have different skins means that the art team has to do a job where the character is cool when you look at a big picture, but also immediately recognizable by silhouette and other things when you're looking down from that 100-foot view and they're running around with other groups. And just, yeah, I have a lot of admiration for the Riot team. I think they've done an amazing job. If I had to name a single favorite character, I tend to play off-meta characters because, and I've actually been out of League for about a year at this point. But I think my favorite, Malzahar, was probably one of my favorites. It's a very underplayed champion. But I play a lot of top laners and mid laners. Awesome.
We definitely have a big League following here, so I'm sure they were very interested in that insight. Let's see. Next up, we have from EJ. So I know this may be like a parent trying to choose a favorite child, but do you have a favorite game that you have worked on?
That's always a hard question. Some of them, like my very first commercial game was EverQuest. And that will always have a fond place in my heart because that was the first game I worked on. And I was super lucky in that the first game I worked on was also a game that went really big. Like at the time, it was one of the biggest games out there. And that that gives a really interesting sense when one of the first things you work on will probably be the best thing you're ever known for. But I loved that. I've loved every game I've worked on. I worked on a DC Comics game that was a ton of fun because I got to read 10 years of DC Comics, like every single thing they put out as background. Working on Catan and VR was fun because we were solving issues of interface that nobody else had figured out yet. That we were the ones pioneering it, and then other groups looked at, oh, you guys did it right, and they copied it. And I love getting into new tech and making things where you're the people trailblazing and kind of doing that. And actually working on Catan, so the guy who designed Catan, Klaus Tuber, had two sons, Benny and Guido, who now both still work for the Catan studio. And we got to work with both Benny and Guido, so Klaus Tuber's sons, on making a game because they were kind of the stewards of their father's IP. Anything Catan related, they get to sign off on to make sure that their father's stuff is still going. And they're both about my age. So they actually bought a VR set and took it home to their dad. And we have like pictures of him, 7-year-old Klaus, like putting on the VR set and looking around is like, wow, it's Catan, with just from the way we did it. And so just from like getting to work with a father-son family legacy on a game that I love playing, it was a ton of fun too. So different things for different games I've worked on. We did a D&D VR battle chess kind of game where I got to work on a D&D official license. Just the fact that it was a D&D official, I mean, that's like bucket list. Hey, I got to work on an official D&D thing. You know, we got to make the first virtual yawning portal that's ever been created in the D&D, any D&D game. So every game can have as a favorite thing. So sorry, not a particular favorite, but favorites from different parts of different games.
Yeah, you definitely checked a couple bucket list items there in my book, so that's pretty cool. Let's see. So we have from Sammy. What's the risk of creating a particularly niche game, but could have a loyal but small audience, such as combining unexpected genres, or that doesn't have much of an obvious market? And how could you determine if the risk versus reward is really going to pay off?
So that's actually that's a great question. So a lot of games go for kind of very broad, big markets, but that often means they have a lot of competition. Where, like I remember I was looking, there's a game on Steam called Euro Truck Simulator, where you're in Europe driving a big rig, and that's what the game is. I think it has 100,000 downloads. It's a niche audience, but if you have a small team, you know, if you're selling that for $10 a piece, hey, you know, I don't even know what the price, maybe it's a $20 game. Say it's a $10 game, you know, you're making $1 million. If you had a team that could put that game out for say $300,000, you just made a wildly successful game. You're earning 3 times what you put in. So niche games are absolutely doable, but it's figuring out how big is my niche and is it competitive? You know, if there were 10 different Euro Truck Simulator games, I wouldn't advise going to make another one of those. For the small market, it's probably oversaturated. But if you've identified a thing where you're like, hey, I think this niche is great. I love it. I think there's people who would also love it. And I think we can make this game for a reasonable amount of money. That's probably a really solid value proposition. Because at the end of the day, you don't have to earn $100 million on your game unless you spent, say, $50 million making it. That, you know, you should always aim to hopefully at least double your production cost, because that will then fund your next game. So if you make a game that costs $100 million, you need to be bringing in at least $200 million. If you make a game that costs you $250,000, you need to make back, say, $500,000. So if you can make a game that costs you $250 and sell that is a niche audience game, but that, you know, you can make a couple of $1 million, like Slay the Spire, a couple people made it. They thought it was going to be niche. It blew up wider. They've probably funded every game their studio will make for the next decade, just off of that, as well as getting rich. So it's a very viable strategy if you can identify what you think is the right niche with the caveat, and you can figure out how to get it to them. because part of Euro Truck Simulator's thing was they figured out how to get people interested in that to know their game exists. And so that's one of the pros and cons to a niche. You might be able to, if you can hit that target group, that might be the best possible game to go make.
Awesome. And it looks like we definitely have some Euro Truck Sim fans here, which is always exciting.
Yeah, I just saw that pop in chat.
Yep, $20 base. So right on the money.
Yeah, so I think those guys made money.
Very definitely. Let's see. Do you have any favorite game dev related textbooks or learning materials you could recommend?
Jesse Schell's Book of Lenses is fantastic. One of my favorites is actually, if for a video game designer specifically, there's a book that has nothing to do with video games. It's by Scott McCloud. It's called Understanding Comics. And it's a graphic novel where a graphic artist breaks down how comic books work. And as a game designer, it is probably one of the single best dissections of a thing I've ever seen. And part of what game designers do is they look at something, they break it down to its component pieces so they can assemble it into the kind of game they want. And every new game designer I've trained up, I've made read that book, and they've all come out better game designers for kind of reading about the breakdown. Again, I can more recommend books kind of on game design as opposed to game industry. But game design, I said Jesse Schell's Book of Lenses, Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, me reading a lot of Malcolm Gladwell's kind of pop stuff like Tipping Point or Outliers is a really good kind of way of thinking differently. Behavioral economics is really interesting for being a game designer. But kind of the biggest one for a game designer is go play a lot of games and play a lot of games that you don't necessarily think are your favorites, that you're playing them to look at what they do. So for example, I don't like racing games. Every once in a while, I will still go play a racing game just to see if there are mechanics or things that they're doing in those games that I might, the next game I make, be like, oh man, the way that this racing game used its, inventory system to modify a chassis, I could take pieces of that to go do part of this RPG I'm working on. So the other one is game teams talk usually referentially. It's like, oh man, the inventory system for Mass Effect 2, not Mass Effect 1, but Mass Effect 2, mashed up with the, diegetic UI, the way that Borderlands did it, of putting the, ammo counters in the guns. They talk that way, where they take pieces off to talk to each other. So having a big proficiency in basically big games as well as kind of the niche games is another thing that just helps. If you were somebody who is a film major, you'd go watch hundreds of movies to build up your film vocabulary. If you're going to be somebody in the game industry making games, you should go play hundreds and hundreds of games to build up your game vocabulary. And play them you don't have to play them all the way through, but play them enough to, go rent games, go play games where you can play on a trial weekend, just so you can blow through a couple hours, be like, cool, I've seen enough, on to the next one.
Awesome. Those are some really great tips. Let's see, we have from Steven. Do you think MMORPGs are still viable in the current game market, as they seem to fall into sort of the freemium category and end up becoming pay to win?
The answer is yes. I think there are plenty of people who still like that kind of game and like that kind of experience, both in the US, in Europe, Korea, China. There's definitely regions that like that a lot. I think that we're due for some innovation on the way that the games get built and monetized. I'm kind of looking to see what is the next best way of doing that, because one of the hardest parts about MMORPGs is that it takes longer to build the content. It might take you this long to build your expansion, and players go through it in this amount of time. And so the audience always goes through it faster than you can actually build it. And so that's why almost all MMOs have grindy kind of stuff in them, and end boss and raid kind of stuff, is they're looking for things that people can keep doing again and again. And this is where a game like League of Legends has an unfair advantage versus, say, an MMORPG, because League has one thing you do, well, a couple, but let's focus on the primary. You go throw down on Summoner's Rift, your five versus the other five. And part of what makes it interesting is what are the updates? What are the recent balance patches? And what are the five characters you picked? What are the five the other team picked? Who was banned? And that combination of all of those makes every game feel fresh and interesting. And that's the heart of the game. But in a game, and that's a PvP kind of game. In a PvE, player versus environment, and you're having to design all of the environmental content, it's just hard. And that's why, again, a lot of the choices end up around what can we do to keep people interested and busy. So I'm really curious to see kind of what the next generation of these does to answer that question.
Yeah, that's super interesting. We're gonna bounce on down to this fun one. Do you have a cat? Because I think we're all hearing some meowing in the background.
I know. Hold on. What are you doing, Percival? Here, you want to come on stream? Come here. He's just out of sight. Here, hold on. Come here. Oh, come on. Here we go. Yes, we have kitty cats who own the house, but there we go. So,
Precious.
Percival and Bella both hanging out behind me. Two rescue cats.
Oh, that's awesome. We love our little furry friends.
Absolutely.
And then we have another little fun one for you. Adam is interested in where you got that Kabuki Snoopy poster in the background.
That one there, my wife is Japanese, so we go to Japan to visit her family a couple times a year. And Snoopy the Peanuts Foundation did some sort of team up with a classic Japanese museums and got a whole bunch of those prints made. So this one above me is actually Snoopy surfing the Great Wave. You can only barely see him right there. And so we actually got those at a Japanese art museum we went to. And I thought they were cool enough, I hung them up. But I'm pretty sure if you Google something like Snoopy and traditional Japanese art, you'd probably find that in somebody who was selling it.
Yeah, I think you take the win.
Officially licensed as opposed to knockoffs.
I think you definitely take the win for coolest background stuff for your Zoom. I think we've all been scoping it out as you're going on, which is pretty cool. Let's see. What are your thoughts on microtransactions in game?
I'm a big fan of them when they're done well. And that if you can make a game that is so compelling that I enjoy the game and I'm interested in buying additional pieces of it, I think that's fine. So for example, in League of Legends, if you're going to give me more character skins, hey, I'm great with that. If there's a skin I like for a character I play, it gives me an extra thing to buy. If you're going to give me in Civ 6 extra leaders to play, Civ launched with like 20 something leaders you could, well enough and truly, you didn't get in and you're like, man, I felt like I only got a couple and they're making me pay for the rest. They launched with enough to be a full game and then some. So part of it is how you treat your audience. If you make a game that it truly feels good, and then you're like, hey, this is obviously extra stuff we're making that you can buy if you want. I think that's a great model. That does mean your game has to be compelling enough that people want to buy that. If you're making a game where it feels like they are kind of shortchanging you pay for a game and you still don't get all the stuff, or it's a free game, but you have to keep dumping in money to even play the game, those I feel like are done poorly. And it is a real delicate balance that I've seen things done very well and very poorly. Like Clash of Clans and Clash Royale, Supercell, those both felt pretty decent. It felt like I felt like I got a benefit from spending some money, but it didn't feel like they were hitting me up over the head all the time to spend. And I felt that when I did spend, actually, especially in Clash Royale, when they did their season passes were, I think, $4.99, and I always felt like they gave me like $30 worth of stuff. And so I was like, hey, I'm going to spend $4.99. You guys are going to give me like $30 worth of stuff. Felt great. So again, it's just kind of the value proposition that is enough that, you as a studio can make money and pay all your employees, but is priced right so that the people playing your game are like, hey, this was good value for the money I spent. And as long as they don't feel ripped off, I think it's great. As soon as you cross that line, though, that's a dangerous thing. But it's not like microtransactions are going to go away. I think they are here to stay.
Awesome. Definitely got to be walking that balance. Let's see. We have one from Grant. What is your opinion on the prices of big games being raised from $60 to $70? And do you think it stems from necessity or a desire for more profit?
It's actually surprising they've stayed 60 for so long, because console games were at 60 at the beginning of the 7th gen consoles, which is 2005 and 2006. That was the Xbox 360, the PS3, and the Wii. And they've actually, the Wii launched at $49.99, PlayStation and Xbox at $59.99. And they've stayed that way basically 2005 through 2020. So that's a really long time to have no raising of prices on games. And arguably, the games you're getting now are bigger, longer, and more robust in some cases than the ones that were getting offered then. So the hard part is consumers are kind of locked into that price. In the same way, that's what most people think of as a premium game, and then it gets discounted. In the same way that when Apple went into the iTunes store and was like, all games should be 99 cents, it kind of anchored everybody's value around that. And it's funny, you might go buy a Starbucks coffee for $4 and you're like, oh, this is fine. But you look at a game that's 99 cents, or excuse me, $1.99 on Apple instead of 99 cents, your brain's like, wow, that's twice what I usually pay. It's half the price of that cup of coffee, but it's twice the price of what you normally pay. So there's a lot of the psychology is actually called the anchoring effect around prices. And one of the only times you can do a reset is when something new happens. And that's why with the new generation of games, they're thinking about a reset on prices. And it's a tricky one because $60 feels like a lot, $70 feels like a lot. But for a lot of them too, the AAA game space and the S tier. So AAA would be, or S tier would be like Clash Royale, Red Dead Redemption, Grand Theft Auto, Call of Duties. These games cost $200 to $300 million to make. And then they spend more money marketing them. That takes a lot of copies to basically sell to even break even on that. And so for a lot of these companies, they're just doing the math. And they're saying, we would like to be able to charge more. And we'll see what the market reaction is to that. But in some cases, it's kind of surprising that they've stayed at $60 or $59.99 for as long as they have. But there's also then we know games will discount, that you can get it immediately for that price. You can wait a couple of months and it'll be discounted a little longer, and you'll get the Game of the Year edition with all the extra stuff at a good price too. So it lets people kind of also choose when to engage with it. But in the games I was talking about that cost a couple $100 million, again, that's all personnel. The last Grand Theft Auto had more than 1,000 people working on it for like 5 or 6 years. I mean, that's a lot of money, and it's all paid up front.
That's a really interesting take on it, very definitely. Kind of
flipping. I'm talking more from the business side of like having run my own studio. You're always looking at, are we making a game that will, earn back more money than we spent on it, so that we have enough money to pay for our next game? Because we like paying for our next game, otherwise we go out of business.
Yep, keeps you going.
Yeah.
Let's see. We are down to our last couple here.
Okay.
We can do a fun one first. Any cat toy recommendations?
Fishing lines, the little rods with the strings and the feathers. Or actually a box. Boxes from Amazon, I think, are our single most popular cat toy.
It's the simple things in life that really keep them entertained.
Yep.
Let's see. Favorite D&D class or race combo?
Bard. And the power gamer in me would say half elf. The stylist in me would say tabaxi.
All right.
I
Respect.
like social characters. I like high charisma. My last couple have been like bard, sorcerer, warlock. I like characters with lots of utility options. I don't even care if the current campaign I'm playing in, I think my bard's killed one thing and he's level 6. But crowd control. Party stays
Definitely. And let's see, our final question of the day comes to whether you like Super Smash Bros. A favorite character and sort of how they're doing the character reveals. Your thoughts on that?
The character reveals, I think, have been really I mean, like the Sephiroth reveal, was not expecting that when they put the trailer out for it. I've always been like, I only really play Super Smash Brothers when I'm at a friend's house. And with the pandemic, like, I don't think I played it in over a year just because I'm not going anywhere. So I'm a little out of the Super Smash Brothers, but I've been watching the reveals. And in general, I actually just bought my nephew a copy on his Switch because he was really wanting it. So at some point I'll get to play again. I'll go over there and I'll play with him. But I like the reveals. I mean, it's doing what the game needs to. It's driving up interest and it's sustaining it over time with, like, same way like when Mortal Kombat did all their different character reveals and fatalities. It's a good way when you have that kind of content to continue to raise awareness, which is one of the things we talked about in the 10 things to know, which is, how will you be promoting your game? Because Super Smash Brothers, one of their USPs, unique selling propositions, is we're going to pull in characters from all these different games and they're going to all brawl with each other. It's going to be fun. And so that's part of their proposition of what makes their game interesting. And you can see that their marketing was specifically designed to help support that proposition. And so they did a really good job of integrating what makes this game unique, along with how they're then kind of showing to everybody else, this is the cool thing about our game. It's a good question because it let me kind of get right to a thing we talked about.
Very definitely looping back. We did get one more, if it's okay with
Sure.
you. It looks like a pretty good one. So at what point should you cut your losses on a game that was received poorly? And how do you feel about the game development history of the game No Man's Sky?
Oh man, No Man's Sky is a saga. Part of it depends on what you're doing it for. If you're doing this as a studio to make sure everybody gets a paycheck, if you're like, every studio I've run, I want both successful games, but I want to make sure that we're not laying off anybody. Everybody gets a paycheck, everybody keeps their health care. We're running this as a business. Our business is to make games. And so we're very aggressive when we're looking at what we're building. And if we ever get to the point where, like, man, we don't need sunk cost fallacy, we're going to look at it and be like, we're just never going to make our money back on this unless there's a contractual obligation. We would rather cut our losses then, because the other one too is I always have 10 ideas for stuff I'd like to be making for the time I have to make every one game. If you're making something that's not going to do well and that, why not just kill it? Go make the thing that you think will do well and might actually get you a good royalty or return. So there's a extra credit to the channel I work for. One of the mantras is fail faster. And it's, as you look at an idea, don't be afraid to just say, okay, this didn't work. Failure is not bad. Failure is a learning opportunity. We're going to fail faster. We're not going to keep doing this for the next couple of months. We're going to kill this thing and work on the next thing. Because there's always a finite amount of time and resources of what you could be doing. So No Man's Sky is interesting, though, because they took in an amazing amount of other people's money and made promises about what you would get. So in that case, cutting or kind of stopping wasn't really, or was a very ethically questionable choice. They could have taken everybody's money and run. They didn't. They kept working on it. And right now it is a much closer thing to what they promised than when they launched it, 2 years ago now, or year? I don't even remember how long ago. Pandemic time all runs together. But they very much have kept working on it to try and make it closer and closer to the game they promised. And the other one is they brought in enough money that they have the ability to do that. They're not going to go out of business by continuing to make the game closer to what they promised all the people who chipped the money in for it. So I think they're doing the right thing.
Awesome. Thank you so much. With that, we are going to be wrapping everything up. So I do want to say a huge thank you to you, Geoffrey, for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
It has been wonderful to hear all of your cool insights and approaches to all this stuff, sort of from the opposite end that I think we're all sitting on today. I do want to say thank you to all the attendees who are still with us today or currently. I am going to drop the sign-in form one more time for any of you who maybe joined us a little late, so make sure you fill that out. But with that, a big thank you to everyone and have a great rest of your days.
See you.